This is the Trusting Our Men interview series, where I explore and unpack what is still stopping us from cultivating trust, partnership, and safety with our men. Join me and my co-host Madelyn Moon as we have difficult conversations with conscious men in hopes of building a bridge of more compassion and understanding. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Trusting Our Men Again series. I am transformational life coach Maddie Moon, and I am here with my co-host and partner, Nadia Munla, and we are joined today with Dave Burns.
So Dave is the founder and head coach of The Business Monk, a company devoted to eradicating the separation between business and spiritual practice. He lives in Santa Monica with his wife, Carolyn, where he devotes his time to ritual, personal practice, and play. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yay, we're so excited.
Okay, so our favorite question to start this off with is a very big question. But we feel it gets us a really good idea of what's currently going on in your world, which we're super interested about, is what is present for you. So our question is, what's currently real for you in the realm of gender relations?
Wow. Okay, good. Just diving straight in.
Yes.
So the Me Too movement is fairly central to me right now. I would say there are other things going on, but that seems like there's nothing in my mind, in my world, that's going on in gender relations that isn't somehow deeply connected to that. So my sense is there's something really huge happening that has the potential to be incredible. I think that can't help but involve some sort of positive change, but that also requires a lot of conscious conversation and deliberate care to move through with grace.
Yeah. I will also say that for me, the impetus for this project and these conversations was because so many men were coming to me privately and sharing a lot of their hesitations, a lot of their fears, a lot of their concerns around, how do I show up? How do I serve? How do I protect? How do I still be in my primal sexuality and honor my own full range, but of course be up to date, so to speak, with the rules and the guidelines. And so I felt it was really important for us as women, which is why me and Maddie are doing this together, to bring this to a public forum and be like, let's talk about the stuff we don't really want to talk about, or that we're talking about one-on-one behind the scenes, and have it be a conversation where we can model what it's like to both be really aware that this is an awesome movement and that it's important for the women to speak up and and it's not just women, of course, but for people to speak up. And at the same time, we can also hold this equally truthful experience of the fear and a lot of the shame that's now coming up for men. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts around that.
Around the fear and the shame specifically?
I'm sure, yeah.
Great. Yeah, I loved what you described about the conversations that you were having with men who are coming to you privately. The fear around, well, I guess the questions around how to stay connected to and not abandoning sort of primal sexuality while also fully receiving the gifts of the movement is huge. This is in a way, this is, I think, one of the three huge questions right now. I'll say on the level of fear and shame, I've certainly experienced a lot of both of those through the years in connection to sexuality in various forms. I guess these days it's less fear, and when it comes up, it's more in the realm of shame. And it's something like which I do my best to melt through, kind of Brene Brown style, by talking about it publicly. But the place that the fear shame conversation kind of hits me personally in connection to Me Too right now is with I'm married monogamously, very monogamously. And we have a really, really good relationship. And so I sort of I guess I feel some sense of expectation to myself to maintain like radical consciousness in our sex life, and to be a sort of model within a relationship um, of devotion to the feminine. And despite all of the various tools that I have, all of the training that I've received around how to be conscious and be in sensitive relationship to the feminine, I can still regularly feel in myself moments in our connection intimately where I slip into exactly the same kind of collapse that on a larger scale that is the thing that's responsible in men for sexual assault, which is basically a retracting of my attention out of her, out of the moment, into myself, and an accompanying kind of blind grasping and trying to get something from her without connection to her. Mm. That happens to me. I still do that regularly, and I carry shame around it often when it comes up. It's something I do my best to correct, but it's like not a crazy thing to me that there are extreme cases of assault in the world, because despite a shitload of practice and training, that same little kind of collapse happens in like a really what I would say is a conscious marriage.
I'm curious, so your wife's name is Carolyn, right? Mm-hmm. Does she ever feel that from you? Like, yeah, you're very self-aware, so you notice whenever that's coming up within you. Does she ever say anything to you like, hold on, I can feel that you're wanting to get something from me, or however she phrases it? But I'm curious, in those moments, how does she speak up when she feels that shift within your energy?
Yeah, she does. I mean, she speaks up different ways. She responds in different ways. I will say, you said that I'm fairly self-aware, so I probably noticed, but this is like the most frustrating thing about this is the thing that ultimately, on a fundamental level, the thing that causes something like assault is unconsciousness. And most of the time, you don't know when you're unconscious until afterwards.
Yeah.
Like that's what defines being unconscious.
Right.
So it feels sort of like coming to. I'm like, oh my God, what just happened? Often with her help. But I've noticed it's interesting. If it starts happening intimately, that kind of unconscious collapsed sort of grasping, trying to get something without connection, it's often started happening other places in life also. And so it's this sort of red flag for how I'm doing business or how I'm approaching the rest of my day. Sorry, I sort of dodged your question. How does she respond? She'll often respond physically. Like there'll be a certain kind of retraction in her. If that's not sufficient, then often verbally. It's certainly something she always talks about after the fact, if not in real time, which I'm super, super, super grateful for.
Yeah, I love that we're like going straight there, because the embodiment or the consciousness piece, I think, is so key, both for the men and the women, I think, or just both partners in general. The idea of being able to drop yourself back into felt sense, and to really like slow down enough to really feel every single nuance and be able to essentially, just notice when everything is going down. And I think for, generally speaking, anyone who is of more feminine essence and then also just has the experience of being a woman in the world, it's harder to speak your truth. There's a lot of, this is not across the board, but I would say that that's a general pattern that I see with my clients. Maddie and I both work with women. There is so much work we do around speaking your truth. And I know this has been my personal experience. I was the worst at saying what I needed, especially in the bedroom, right? But it felt like just complete shutdown. Like my nervous system just went into total like suddenly nothing can even be voiced. And I think that the more I dropped into my body and the more I started to slow down and do my embodiment practices, the more I was starting to be able to actually speak my truth and say the things that I wanted without feeling like my entire world was going to collapse as a result of it. And I think for the men, it's sort of it's a similar process of deepening into your embodiment, but it's more in order to listen to the nonverbal cues that are showing up in their partner's bodies. So I'm curious if either of you have any thoughts on that.
I have lots of thoughts, but Maddie, I would love to hear from you.
I want to hear from you. I'm kind of just like observing this question for a moment.
Sure. Yeah, it's like it makes a lot of sense, but it's a really, really tragic thing. I think that the conditioning for women tends to be in the direction of shutting down voice, specifically in the connection to sex, because like the repercussions of that for women generally are way worse than they are for men. Like, if this is obviously huge generalizations, but like on a statistical level, if men have trouble sharing their voice, like really expressing their truth in the moment intimately, then most of the time, worst case scenario is they have not stellar sex. And for a woman, if she has trouble sharing her truth intimately, worst case scenario is sexual assault and violence and pain. So the disparity, I was reading, this is when the Me Too movement first started. There was an incredible article, I can't remember the writer. It was about polling men and women on bad sexual experience that they'd had. And a bad sexual experience for a man is like kind of disappointing. It's like they don't ejaculate, it wasn't especially pleasurable. For a woman, it was bad sexual experiences are pain and violation. So the stakes in my eyes are way higher, way higher. And because of that, there's sort of a responsibility for, there's a responsibility on the side of the masculine to, I want to say this deliberately, but I feel really strongly about it. There's a responsibility to not put responsibility on the partner for expressing her truth. Like, I think embodied practices and unlocking the voice are like incredible feminine practice. And there's some amazing teachers who help with that. And I think YouTube might be some of them. I wish I was more familiar with your work, but ultimately the relying on that is like a huge crutch on the men's side. Like, expecting a woman to be able to say exactly what she wants in an intimate moment, especially if it's vulnerable or she's any kind of state of surrender, is sort of, that's super irresponsible to me.
Yeah, this is fascinating, because I was thinking earlier about that moment when you were saying that Carolyn goes like this, and how in our embodiment practices, we're trying to constantly learn how to go like this in moments when we want to go like this. But what I'm starting to realize more and more that I do this work is that when I do this and I expand, if anyone's listening on audio, if we have that, if I'm trying to expand in moments when my body wants to contract, what that really is a withholding of my truth, and it's doing him a disservice. Or no?
Yeah, that's so beautifully said.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's this interesting line that I'm trying to find of, I want to open to how you are and who you are, and like be available to love. And yet I don't want to abandon myself in the moments that, because it's already so hard to know as a woman, I'll speak for myself, but I think for most women, when you are truly a yes and when you are truly a no, since we are still on the path to learning that, if we're trying to just constantly put a Band-Aid, so to say, on every instance and say, let's just open, we really are holding ourselves back from becoming intimate when we are a no and when we want to contract. And it is doing a disservice to our partner, because it's not teaching him what our body language is like and what our hearts are like whenever they want to contract, which would serve him to know how to read us better.
Right. That's really beautifully said. I've never heard anyone quite put it that way.
Thank you.
And I'm going to throw in yet another perspective to this mix, which is I think that there's a way to be in both. So I think that there is a way to say, okay, yes, we acknowledge that we're sort of in this weird chapter of humanity. There's some paradigm shifting going on. We're realizing, oh, wait, there was a lot of stuff where, under a certain system, men were just less aware. They didn't need to be as conscious as to the consequences of certain actions. So we can be in that and really acknowledge that we're shifting over. And in that shifting over, women are still figuring out how to speak their true yeses and nos. And I also think that we shouldn't completely take the responsibility off of women and say, oh, okay, well, because we're in this shift, okay, the guys have to really deal with all of this stuff because you know what? It's been so hard for us for so long. Like, I feel like having too much of it being like tipping the scales of responsibility to one or the other just feels like we can do so much work too. And yes, I would love a partner who's incredibly sensitive to the fact that I'm still figuring it out. And I have years and years of baggage of men who've shut me down and silenced me. And that's why it's a lot harder on my nervous system to speak the truth in that moment, even if that person is awesome and safe and all the things. So I think there's a place where we can like juggle that and be in both.
I love that. Yeah.
Awesome.
And I guess, yeah, I want to clarify that I'm a huge proponent for men taking 100% responsibility. And there's a risk in talking about that of kind of taking away agency and sovereignty from women. And I don't want to do that. Ultimately, Carolyn and I have one of our wedding vows to each other was to each take 100% responsibility for the other person's experience, which is like a super unhealthy thing to do. But ultimately, I think a model like that is sort of necessary for the next stage of healing.
Wow. This is like, yeah, so this is opposite of everything that I have tried so hard to integrate into my life. Like, your experiences is not in my control. It's your experience. You have your own. And that's kind of something I go to now in reconciliation, but also in fights. I can use it both ways. Like, I'm not responsible for this frustration you feel. And then whenever we're coming back together, I'm like, I'm not responsible for this frustration you feel. Like, I can use it in all these different ways. So that can be a healthy approach, and it can also be an unhealthy approach. It sounds like it's very similar to what you're sharing here, that you could use it unhealthy to say, I'm responsible for the way that you feel, but sounds like this is a very, like you said, next level conscious way to have more empathy. This conversation of empathy has come into a few of our conversations around this topic. And I think this very much comes into play with what you're saying.
100%.
Awesome. We want to hear a little bit more about your story. Maddie, do you want to dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. So in your path to manhood, so to say, did you go through periods of time where you were constantly trying to prove that you were a man through, and I'm a little unclear on some of your stories, so this is new for me to hear, but prove through sex, drugs, alcohol, success, athleticism, any kind of rites of passage that you tried to put yourself through to gain recognition, to be in your manhood, and as Nadia put it earlier, until you found your way to your kinghood. Is that what you said?
I said kinghood, and I was like, is that a word? I don't think so. But we just made it up.
Totally a word.
I like kinghood.
I love that word.
Kinghood.
I don't care if it's a word. We'll use it. Okay.
Right, great.
That was, I have to say, I really love the term. I might not get it right, but it's something like, were there any rites of passage that you tried to put yourself through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a beautiful concept to me. I had never quite thought, but I guess there's a number there's a number of different sort of traditional experiences that men might seek out because they're missing a standard rite of passage into manhood currently. and so end up taking sort of unconscious, terrible, collapsed versions of that path. That's really beautiful. I would love to explore that idea further. But on a personal level, were there any, you used this idea of proving that I was a man in various ways. Were there any ways that I tried to do that?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I still try to do that. That's not done at all.
Oh, well, I would love to hear the then and now. That'd be fascinating.
Yeah, that's okay. This is a tangled web. I'll share it. So various things that I've tried to do at different times in order to prove that I was a man to myself and others have included, obviously, the suppression of feeling. There's a freezing, so there's an inner suppression of feeling, like trying to block it off internally. And then there's something a little different, which is like the external suppression of expression of feeling, which, I mean, I'm likely going to be de-thawing that for a long time. There's like still, you can see if I have a feeling, it like still has a little bit of trouble moving through my face. You can I have like a certain stoic, it's going to take a long time to melt that. And I've done a lot of work on it. Like I do healing work, but it's still, I mean, I was raised in a context where kind of the dominance of a man was established by his ability to not show feeling through the face, particularly. So those are sort of the standards. And then in terms of external action, yeah, I mean, external success in the forms of like musical accomplishment. I was a musician. I was a professional musician for a little bit. The kind of like the rock star archetype attempts to prove. A huge one for me early on was doing way more drugs than anyone else could do. That was a really key one for me in college. Like the capacity to take enormous amounts of drugs and then still function in some way. Function meant loosely, but that one was really like I was a drug addict, but a huge driving force for the quantity of drugs that I consumed was a feeling of masculine competition. And it was sort of I was like not the most athletic guy in college. I was not the most academically successful. And so it was one terrain where I could kind of consistently establish masculine dominance. There's a lot of others that I could go into, but I'll pause there.
Well, I feel like I'd love for us to keep going on this this journey around the exploration of rites of passage as a whole. So, I loved hearing your story, and then I imagine there's so many other guys who had a similar situation. And we spoke about this briefly in one of our other interviews, but the idea of, a lot of like frat houses, and there's just a lot of versions of, I guess, the sort of toxic or distorted rites of passage, like these initiation, what do they call them? Hazing, right? Isn't it? It's hazing. Oh my God. When I first moved to the States and I was like, you guys do what? And realized it was a pretty normal thing that most people did in university. So, these are examples of sort of the lack of rites of passage that do occur in, or that should I say don't occur in the Western world, but there's a lot more of that in other cultures, somehow making it, I guess, less required for the guys to prove that their self-worth or prove that they are now like a dude.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's interesting because, first off, I have to say the thing that both of you are bringing up here is not something that I've ever talked about in this context before, and I think it's a brilliant observation. I'd never thought of it. It makes a ton of, like, the importance of rites of passage and the kind of shadow element of not having it. I've never quite seen in this way in connection to proving manhood. So really beautiful. I hope this conversation continues after this. I'll certainly be continuing it with various people. There's something interesting about the idea of proving that one is a man, which intrinsically feels obviously unhealthy. As if it comes in sort of modern transformational sphere, you could say that it's coming from a place of not enoughness. that is coming from a place of imperfection, that it's likely rooted in some kind of wounding or trauma. I think all of that's true. And the idea of the feeling of proving something, specifically of proving one's own worth, is it's a pretty fundamental masculine drive in my eyes, in my experience. I could certainly say for myself, it's like the Iliad is basically all about Achilles proving his worth. It's like pretty fundamental in terms of the masculine archetypal story in some way. It's the whole thing is about his anger at feeling like his worth was compromised and feeling the need to prove it. So I think obviously there's really fucked up, twisted forms of it. And it's pretty much always unhealthy, but there's also this certain kind of underlying, like, grinding masculine rage that my experience is just inherent in the body. It's inherent in my body. It doesn't go anywhere. It has all sorts of unhealthy expressions, but if I can attach it to ideals that are true to me, if I can attach it to different levels of consciousness, then it can be harnessed for beautiful purposes.
Yeah. I think, well, I want to see, Madelyn, I feel like you've got a something.
Well, I'm thinking about, first off, that I love thinking of what you're saying now, and then also in the claim her or leave her post you wrote, there's like the two sides that you bring up. Like, we don't want to be using, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, so I won't go too into it, but we don't want to be using phrases like man up anymore, because it's negative and it's pushing people further away from feeling their feelings. And yet there's something about it that we can unpack and look at. And that's what you're doing here. And my teacher, John Wineland, talks about, John, he talks about whoever is more focused on the purpose of a relationship is in the masculine pole, and whoever is more focused on the love in a relationship is in the feminine pole. And so hearing what you're saying, I feel and I resonate with this idea that worthiness would be beneficial to have something as important in our life if we have the healthy ideals, like you said, the North Star, the intentions that are conscious rather than the unconscious ones, not getting rid of worthiness being important altogether, but refocusing consciously. Because if you are in touch with your inherent worthiness with these ideals, you can also be the one to step up, say if you are a man with the masculine pole, to be the one concerned with the purpose of the relationship, which creates more polarity, which is great.
I love that.
And something that keeps coming to mind is, actually, this came up on an interview that was not part of the series at all. It was just someone interviewing me for a podcast. But funny enough, this came up because I guess I've just been in this world right now. And that is the idea of, and I was speaking to a man, and it was, he brought up this idea that I thought was interesting. And I'm curious what both of you think about this, which is that for women, again, with a primarily feminine essence, there is this need to feel safe, right, in order to soften and melt and open. And actually, for a man of primarily masculine essence, there doesn't need to be safety. And that, in fact, sometimes adrenaline and, testosterone shoots up when there's lack of safety, and where there's a sense of I don't know what, danger and possibly taboo or whatever might bring up that energy. And I never really thought about it that way as well. I never thought about the fact that there's these two opposing energies that require, in a way, different environments. And that can bring up also part of why it could be really difficult for a man to understand why it's so important to create 100 candles and put on the music and do the things.
Set a time, container.
17 hours of foreplay, right? So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, because this has sort of been lingering in the back of my mind since that interview, and I haven't fully digested it, and it feels really connected to what we're speaking to as well.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I guess my question then, going off of what you're saying, is where do we come into play for that? Because like bringing in John again, he talks about don't tell men what to do. And that's probably a whole nother topic that we could save for another day. But like we evoke in the masculine what we want. And like what you're sharing is like, I want to just tell the person I'm with, like here, like this is what's going to make me safe. Let's talk about it. Let's analyze it. And I wonder if that defeats the creation of that happening. So as women, what could our role be to help that be interpreted? Do you have any ideas on that? Is my question making sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Would you give maybe just one slightly more specific example to help me ground it?
Yes.
Like a context in which that would come up?
Yes. So having the conversation with your lover, it's important for me to feel safe because this and this and this. When your lover, say, is very masculine, it's not sinking in. It's not sinking in. It's not sinking in. At a certain point, do we as women need to take a step back and then let the men's group do their magic and work? Or if they don't have a men's group, just like, what do we do to help it to get understood?
Yeah. Good. Awesome. Okay. I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I'm going to try to rein it in. First off, I guess I do want to say, I think this shit is enormously complicated. I don't think this is easy. That's why I think it's really, really amazing you guys are having many of these conversations over time. Because ultimately, I don't think we're going to move consciously through the transition that's happening in gender relations by coming up with like a 4-step formula for relating. Like it's not going to happen. So that's just kind of context for all of this. I will say the work that various people teach, especially in the space of polarity, polar sacred intimacy work, around helping feminine identified beings express feedback in a way that's not directive and controls polarity, I think that's really beautiful work. Did I cut out for a minute?
You were good.
Okay, great. I think that's really beautiful work. And just from personal experience, like I've experienced incredible treasures in my life as a result of Carolyn authentically in real time, just letting her heart break open and yell at me or cry and just tell me how something hurts or feels, like rather than telling me strictly what to do. Like my life has improved drastically every single time she's ever done that, without exception. Like my business has grown as a result of that. It's in very practical ways. So I'm a huge advocate for like real-time authentic emotional expression without blame or shame. I think that's awesome. And I think there's a risk when we get into this terrain and we're talking about like women broadly, how can you get it through to a man that you need certain things in order to feel safe without emasculating him? I think there's a risk of entering into kind of restrictive formulae if we take that conversation in a particular direction. Ultimately, like I don't think the answer is to start giving more restrictions to how people are allowed to express their feelings. I think it's opening up wider and wider permission for how they're allowed to express their feelings. And this is a little bit controversial, because I'm basically saying I think it would help a lot. It would help men a lot if women were less worried about communicating in healthy ways.
Yeah. And I think also there's a lot to be said about the commonalities of our nervous systems as well. Like, yes, there is, places for the polarity work, and also there's places for just like two humans communicating. And I think in that sense, there's a lot more that we have in common than we have different. in terms of, not feeling defensive or reactive, based on how the person is just laying out the information. Anytime, we say, I feel this, or my experience is that, like, this is really basic 101, I guess, communication. It's going to come across better than, you're an asshole. You know what I mean? Like, just straight up. So I think that, there's a place for both of those, and as we can meet in the middle.
Totally. I 100% agree with that. I think that's what you just said is precisely this is one of the greatest dangers of the conversations that happen in the sacred intimacy polarity world, is that people might start feeling like they're not allowed to have non-polar conversations, where they're just authentically expressing what they actually feel without worrying about it fitting into a particular shape. Mm-hmm. I think how you said it is really beautiful, Nadia.
Yeah, and I find that really refreshing that you're saying this and like reminding us of this, because especially when I first started doing this work, I remember just this one like statement that was I think it was like a session where it really sunk in on evoking what I wanted in the masculine, keeping the polarity alive, not speaking too directly about what I wanted. And it just was like, like I couldn't figure it out. Like, how do I get I don't want to say get what I want, but also there is a degree of getting what I want. And doing it through my sensuality and my body and like open-hearted expression, which, like you were saying, is so powerful and so beautiful and so needed in this world, because so many of us women are like way up here in our minds. And so it is a beautiful art to learn to do that. And let's also not lose our voice as we're learning how to get it back. So it sounds like the work that we are doing here is learning how to speak our truths and hold on to that, and also feel in our bodies, get embodied. And this is for everyone. This is for men. This is for women. Speaking our truth, staying connected to the heart.
Yeah. And, so I love that we're in both the sort of the polarity conversation and the just general, like, good communication conversation. And it makes me think about, like, okay, so how do we make consent sexy? Because I know myself, even as a woman, yes, of course, I want to feel 100% safe. And I'm obviously all about consent. And there is this place where sometimes those conversations, the hot and steamy, the conversation the hot steamy session, can sort of feel like wah wah. So I don't know if any of you have thoughts around that, and how what we already spoke about might sort of weave into all of that.
Yeah, that's such a good question. That's like such an incredibly useful inquiry, I think.
I don't know the answer.
My first answer is not the one that I'm going to say is probably like, this is the way my mind goes. And I think it goes to show for how our society is, like the uncomfortable things to avoid killing polarity. My mind was immediately like text message, like just text it all, like get it all out there via like phone. So you don't have to talk about it in person. And when you already know when you're together and the hot steamy starts, you got that out of the way.
I love it.
Well, it's interesting because I'm sort of in this place where there's a new potential little something, and there's been a lot of that, like sort of like speaking stuff up front and doing it, just like dropping one little thing at a time, and doing it. I know, obviously nowadays a lot of it is through text message or just actual phone calls, but that's a very new experience for me personally. And I feel like that's part of me setting us both up to win, so that there isn't this like, oh, now I'm totally in it and I'm confused and I don't know what to do. And I didn't say that thing about the thing and and then like sort of making it really difficult for him to succeed, I guess, in that way. I don't know. It's all new territory.
Yeah. It is. Well, it is really new territory. Like these conversations have not been had before like this, that's rare. Like a lot of conversations have been had already about lots of things.
Right.
But this is genuinely new territory we're all in. Figuring it out this does not feel to me like a simple process, but it feels like one of the more important ones in the world right now. I had a couple of thoughts. I think with the conversation about making consent sexy, I think it needs to be a long conversation. But the first two things that feel really important to me in connection to that are, one, it's like, what's a good metaphor? In the fact that it's harder to maintain, potentially harder in certain contexts, to maintain hot polarity while bringing in a consent conversation is sort of great. I don't think, because it requires greater consciousness. I don't think it's in no way necessary for the chemistry and electricity to drop in order to have a consent conversation at all. It's totally possible for it to drop, but it's not at all necessary to. And so the fact that you need an additional level of awareness to maintain some level of chemistry is amazing. It's amazing because it means that people are more likely to be online fully. That part, which is awesome. I think as long as there's a risk of people feeling like they need to sacrifice one for the other. It's like either they have a consent conversation or they maintain just raw animalistic chemistry. But it's totally possible to have both, and doing so means you need to be more present. That's amazing. But the more important thing in the context of the consent conversation is like, I strongly feel that the consent movement is incredible and necessary, and also nowhere near enough. Like nowhere near enough. I think verbal consent is a really low bar, really, really low bar. And ultimately the capacity to feel other people's bodies and know what's going on inside of them is of more fundamental importance and needs to be taught on a really broad scale.
I want to bring up something that Maddie and I were talking about around this, which is there's sort of controversy and debate as to whether we think it's hot and sexy that someone asks us along the way as we're hooking up, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, being on the other side.
The question, as a man, is it hot or sexy?
Well, do you
how do you feel about asking?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess just your view, like as a man, would you feel like this is the way to keep polarity alive and to get consent, is asking along the way? And also, I know we're definitely up on time here, so this will be our last question, then we'll go in quick fire.
Yeah, so I think that asking every single step of the way, like every single microsecond, is actually 100% necessary. I think it's 100% necessary. And I think it's often accomplished. I want to be really careful with how I say this. So, especially because I'm speaking now in the context of my own marriage. It's 100% necessary to be asking every step, like every microsecond, is this okay? And it's possible to be doing that non-verbally. Like yeah. I am always, and we talked at the beginning about how I collapse and I don't do this, but I'm always making it a practice to ask constantly, not just whether it's okay, but whether this is the most blissful possible thing I can be doing in this moment when I'm with Carolyn. But I'm asking her body that with my attention. I'm rarely asking that with my words.
Just makes me so melty, like even
that's
thinking
it's hot.
Yeah, like, are you feeling her? Are you feeling into her? Are you feeling her body? What is her body saying? Like, yeah, it's definitely very hot.
Yeah. So now you know our response. Um, and I love this because I think that it's a reminder that we all as humans need to continue to practice to get more embodied, in whatever version that is for us, so that we can have a lot of these conversations non-verbally. I think right now, because we've been living in a world that has us so disconnected from our bodies, we have the majority of people have zero clue. I mean, I got to tell you guys, I hooked up with someone this year and I was like, younger generation. So now I get what's going on there, but there's like it's like a whole nother ball game. And there was just like zero, like you were like there, I was like, are you here? Like, just, I did not feel anyone there. And I had to just stop everything because I was like, this is not going to work out. I'm sharing this because I do think the younger generation, speaking as though I'm so old, but like, there's a lot of, the technology is a piece of, I mean, there's so many things, the lifestyle technology, there's a lot of different things that are having us disconnect and move up and out. And therefore there is all this talk of like, we have to speak the words, is this okay? And I think that there is this place again of coming back to the combo, that we have to get embodied first, really.
Yeah. And as women, we have to reveal. Like, you can't read our body if we're not revealing and staying connected to our heart throughout the process of it. We can disassociate, and that is something you can read too. Someone who's being very careful to read the woman they're with, you can see when she's disassociating if you're doing your work to really understand what that looks like. Oh yeah, and I wanted to say that on the topic of is this okay? Something that was a happy medium for me, that I was with someone who was really into like he's the one who introduced me to all this intimacy work and tantra, and he worked with Charles Muir, who's like a tantra teacher, and he would just look at me along every single step of the way, and he would say yes, but he, like, I just did it like a puppy dog, but he would do it really like sweet. He'd just be like yes in a like really sensual way. He'd just say yes, and he'd wait for me to say yes. Just so simple. I knew what he was asking. He was feeling my body and he was reading me. And I mean, it was really wonderful for me. So I think for any man who's on that path to learning nonverbal cues, like this yes question, I think it's a happy place to not totally kill the polarity with a very long question, and just something simple. So yes. So that brings us to where people can find you online.
thebusinessmonk.com.
I love it. Straightforward.
Nadia?
Okay, quick fire round. All right, so these are all questions to be answered with one word. Just going to throw them at you. First, what do you love most about the feminine?
All.
What do you love most about the masculine?
Nothing.
What do you want to see more of in women?
Truth.
One word to describe yourself.
Happy.
One word to describe what you'd like to see come out of this gender conversation.
Cherishing.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.